Thanks, folks. Appreciate you coming down. So I'm going to give a brief talk that's something of a companion to John's talk. We're living in very interesting times in Australia. It was all quiet on the Western Front only a few years ago, and now there is never a dull day. It's quite a phenomenal situation. So here are some of my key affiliations. I head up the Monash University Clinical Psychedelic Lab. I'm a co-founder and chief scientific officer of Clarion Clinics, scientific advisory to Mind, and also scientific advisory to Inconnex. Here are the wonderful folk that I work with and appreciate very much, some of who are here today in this first lab established in Australia, where we do many dosing sessions every week in this wonderful room, replete with its launch pad and portal to the stars. And just to give you a little bit of context to what I'm going to say here, obviously we're all aware that things are very rapidly moving, and very rapidly disappearing. In the psychedelic space, there are hundreds of trials active now. There are actually hundreds of companies, and already the productivity with respect to academic output is dwarfing the first wave by a long way. We have, to my last count, these are drug development trials, so not academic trials, 19 in phase 1, 24 in phase 2, and 2 in phase 3, and with MAPS and Compass leading the charge with respect to their phase 3 trial work, and very likely FDA approval for MDMA and PTSD next year based on the second phase 3 study being already wrapped up. In Australia, there were almost, the first trial got approved in 2019, second in 2020, third in 2021. It was very slow going. By my last count, 28 active or funded trials across the country. So it is getting very busy, although it's worth saying, with respect to the trials that have actually seen patients, these are them, and most of these trials have only seen 1, 2, 3 participants, with a few notable exceptions, or 2 at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. They've seen 35 in their clinical trial. At Monash, we've seen about 55 in one of our clinical trials, but mostly it's very early days. And in that context, this came as quite a surprise to us, what John just discussed. So I won't take any time really going through the details, because John did a fantastic job of that. But this is, as you heard before, a bifurcated down scheduling of S9s to S8s. That is, they become controlled medicines only when used in certain ways by certain people. And that is MDMA for PTSD only, psilocybin for TRD only, to be used by psychiatrists and their teams. You need this application to an IRB or HREC, Human Research Ethics Committee. You need an application to the TGA. There are possible state and territory conditions and limitations. There's the college guidelines. And this was announced on the 3rd of February this year and rolled out from the 1st of July, although by rollout, as John described, it remains to be seen. That is just the law has changed. And there were all kinds of question marks and concerns and excitement, and people wondered whether this might happen. But I don't think it's going to quite look like this. Although if it does come, it is important to go for your toad-free formula, for sure. So what are the concerns? Here are some of the concerns. Was this premature? Did this come too early before phase 3 clinical trials have been wrapped up and regulatory approvals been given? Was it rolled out too quickly, particularly in the Australian context, where we're very new to the space? Was the lead time long enough? Is there adequate monitoring or not? And is that monitoring harmonized? These are some of the concerns that I share. Is there adequate reporting required? Is that reporting to the public? And what do we do in the situation where there is no working group or formal collaborative learning process that has been established, where everybody can, in effect, operate in silos and not be transparent with what their outcomes are and not learn in a collaborative? There are some comforts on the other side. There's some people that have felt that this is progressive rather than stigmatized and prohibitive. and that there are numerous guardrails, as John outlined, from HREC to college to TGA, and so on. It's, the barrier to entry is high, for sure. There is, by some people's account, this opportunity to successfully treat a far greater number and diversity of help seekers, and that is clearly why we're all in this line of work. And this opportunity for real-world implementation, so to develop best practice on the ground, to train professionals, and to assess things like cost effectiveness in the real world. This gives us a real opportunity to strike out ahead of the pack and try to ask these questions that in many cases can only really be asked when you roll out in-service delivery. So I have a few key questions and kind of recommendations, if you like. I've taken the liberty to make some recommendations to my colleagues in Australia and to those who will move into service delivery contexts. How do we do this moving from the lab to the clinic? So my key questions that I ask are, who does the treating? Who gets treated? Well, that's the emojis have been broken somehow. What is the treatment? Who pays for it? How do we do how to inform and consent participants or patients, and how to monitor the whole process? So I'm going to go through just a set of recommendations. These are reasonably rudimentary, and some of them are my perspective, not necessarily watertight and held up by evidence. So the first one I'd say is to use a multidisciplinary team, and that team needs to have specialist psychedelic-assisted therapy training. And that may be clear to most people, but it still is something that people argue about. To consider the psychedelic exposure option within training. That's something I'm going to present at 3:30 this afternoon, so you can come along and hear my hot take on that and the research that we conducted in our lab. But this is an interesting question to take forward. How do we train therapists in the space? And is there a role for therapists having their own psychedelic experience? And if so, how to do that well? Ensuring supervised practice. That seems to be an essential part of what we've done in our group and in many groups around the world with experienced supervisors, and we're hoping to establish a network of international supervisors in collaboration with Mind and others, hopefully in the not too distant future. And there's some advantage to an apprenticeship model that's also used in many groups. To emphasize early, ongoing, and substantial team development. This is intensive work, and to just simply roll into psychedelic therapy from your usual healthcare context without recognizing that there's going to be a need for a substantive team development, I think is naive. It's intensive work. It's unusual in lots of ways. So these are some of the key recommendations that I'd have. Questions about who is treated. That symbol is incorrect. I don't know what that means or how that got in there, so ignore that. So we need to implement extensive screening. In many of the trials, we do screening for safety. But in the context of service delivery and people paying out of pocket in particular, we really need to do screening for suitability as well. And I would suggest we need to consider these multiple stages of screening, from psychiatric to physical to concomitant medications to somebody's context to psychotherapeutic capabilities. Does a help seeker who's entering into this treatment have the appropriate context and internal resources to not be excessively destabilized and to leverage the opportunity that the psychedelic treatment can offer? I think it's also important to consider the client's external professional and personal supports. Again, another feature of the context that I think can be underemphasized in typical mental health care, but I think is important here. And we need to consider ways in which we can move from these very rigid and constrained eligibility criteria to treating a greater diversity of patients, but we need to do that stepwise, sensibly, slowly. And where we do this, whether it's new indications, if they're permitted, or just relaxing exclusions in various ways, that we need to provide additional support and additional monitoring as we move out to, into uncharted territory. There are a number of different ways to do this. In some of the recent trials, it begins with looking at people self-medicating in the wild, naturalistic observational study to understand basic safety and efficacy signals, and then you can move into trials. And I'd suggest that's also a reasonably good way to do it in the clinic. But clearly we can't continue to treat just the unicorn patient, as a lot of trials do. What kinds of treatments are offered? Well, I would primarily say the following, which is that we need to consider this as an augmented psychotherapy, and that we need to refer back to best practice in psychotherapy, not just psychedelic psychotherapy. There's a lot of work that's been done in psychotherapeutic research and practice over the last 100 years, and I think we really need to rest more heavily on that. My view here is that the promise of psychedelics, if it is to be fulfilled, will be via extended and tailored care, not these very brief interventions with very minimal psychotherapeutic support. I think there may be a place for very brief interventions with minimal or no psychotherapeutic support, but that's likely not to look like psychedelic-assisted therapy. It's likely to look like psychoplastogens or some new psychotropic medication. Important that we emphasize the setting, cast of characters, and particularly the alliance. Again, these are well-known features of psychedelic-assisted therapy trials, but as we move into the clinical context, many people that come into that have not worked in trials before and may not understand the precedent. We need to consider the dyad model, which is the standard within psychedelics to therapists, but we also, for various reasons, need to consider other models, and already that's being done in a few clinics around the world, like the Rover model, where there's actually a single therapist for the duration of the treatment, but the opportunity for somebody else to step into the room as needed in an ongoing fashion. We also need to consider finite treatment models. I'd advocate for, even if we have extended treatment models, to have finite treatment models where there's an endpoint, primarily because there's a tendency towards increased dependence. Now, I wouldn't make that a blanket rule. I think that should be a clinical decision, but I would suggest that it'd generally be a smart idea to ensure that there's an endpoint to that clinical relationship. And I also think we need to consider redosing limits. In contemporary trials, there have been very few redosings, usually 1, 2, or 3 dosing sessions in a treatment paradigm. There's been no work so far on relapse prevention and ongoing redosing into the future. So we need to consider the potential for a higher number of doses than have ever been used in clinical trials, but I'd suggest, at least to begin with, we need to start with some caps on that, and perhaps something like no more than 6 in a year for the large doses of long-acting psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD and MDMA. Who pays for it? This is a big one, big conversation in Australia at the moment. I think the critical thing when we are looking at this early access kind of context, like in Australia, where the HTA or the government reimbursers haven't come on at the very start, that we need to pursue a whole range of creative ways to get reimbursement. So private insurance may come on, membership orgs like Veterans Affairs and trade unions and the like. Lots of these big organizations pay for the mental health care of their members, and they may be interested in this if it saves them money in particular. And of course, we need to aim ultimately for government reimbursement. And in order to do that, we need to start with rigorous and harmonized economic evaluation. I would suggest that, a lot of people will say that the change in scheduling or the regulatory approval of a drug like this is the critical point at which a drug becomes available. Particularly when it's expensive like this, I think it is reimbursement that is the critical point at which these treatments become available. And we're not going to get there unless we do solid economic evaluations with the data that the payer wants to see. I would suggest that despite the very important need to increase access and reduce costs, we need to always consider safety first, efficacy second, cost effectiveness third. There is definitely this potential for a race to the bottom as we find cheaper and cheaper products. A lot of people talk about the cost of psychedelic-assisted therapy. The cost is high, and they refer to psychedelic-assisted therapy as though it's just a thing. It's one thing. All the clinics have just got that thing, and this clinic has got a cheaper version of that thing. Well, clearly, that is not the case. Psychedelic-assisted therapy can look like one dose, one prep, one integration, all done in 1 week, or it can look like, in the case of the clinics that we're setting up, 9 months of substantive psychotherapy with multiple dosing sessions. So we need to talk about what you're paying for in the same conversation as we talk about the cost, so that we can avoid this race to the bottom in terms of safety and efficacy. I'd suggest that when people are paying a large amount out of pocket, that we also need to consider affordability as part of eligibility. There is something that we refer to as dangerous disappointment, even when people are not paying for it in clinical trials. People want the treatment, and if they land up in the placebo condition, or if they don't get the outcomes they wanted, they can be disappointed in quite an extreme way. And clearly, having paid a lot of money for your treatment increases the risk of that kind of disappointment. So we do need to consider, in the same way that I'd suggest that we consider context as part of eligibility, that this is part of context. How to inform and consent. So here's one that is important as we move into clinics. Many folk who are getting into clinics are not deeply familiar with research protocols or the results or the eligibility, the complexities. Maybe they've read some papers, but some folk really have not taken the time to apprentice themselves to the people at the coalface and learn about what actually happened in those trials and how the protocol was actually implemented, what lessons were on the ground. The paper typically tells you very little. And I think that's incredibly important. If you're going to inform your patients about what they're getting into, you need to understand the precedent. Also, if you're going to do something different than what's done before, which I'd suggest there's a good case for it here, like, for example, increasing diversity of patients that get access, you really need to know the precedent very well, so you've got a sound rationale for varying from precedent, and you can also tell your client that what you're doing has not been done in research trials before. With 95% of people excluded in almost all research trials in the modern era, the majority of people that are going to get access to the authorized prescriber pathway would have been excluded. They need to know that. We need to also address expectations of this being a silver bullet treatment, or that it's a passive drug type of treatment, that people really come in with a clear understanding of how this involves a lot of psychotherapeutic process and hard work. And we need to consider things like advanced care directive and consent for therapeutic touch that Rachel spoke about yesterday. I mentioned this before, we also need to prepare for the possibility of disappointment, particularly in the context of cost. How to monitor it? So this is something that unfortunately is not widespread or mandated in any way in the new context, and I think this is one of the greatest concerns that many of us have, that while there are all kinds of guardrails in place and people may well do a very good job in Australia, we don't have the infrastructure to learn as a group. We don't have a set of processes and monitoring in place that allow us to iterate and learn very quickly across multiple sites. We'll be learning from our own site, which is a bit of a missed opportunity. But I would suggest that all sites should track client outcomes and service satisfaction, and also track feedback from their staff and needs, and be able to respond and iterate quickly as they go through this, because in many ways this is quite experimental. We're doing something that hasn't been done before. I'd also encourage all clinics in the space to establish independent monitoring and maybe participate in some independent registry, and to publish those results and be transparent, and to ensure staff and clinic accountability, of course, is essential. The onus is on every clinic to really set up a context in which monitoring is happening and transparent communication is happening. What's happened? It's jumped out of there. All right, I'm going to be wrapping up in a second. So here are my, perspectives on the greatest near-term risks to psychedelic therapies. And obviously, as we move into service delivery and implementation in Australia, we get to kind of run the experiment faster and sooner than most places. There are people that are concerned about the overwhelming effects of this therapeutic approach. I'm more concerned about the underwhelming effects of this therapeutic approach. Of course, we need to take the overwhelming effects in mind, and I think there's a whole lot of effort and guardrails set up to minimize that a lot. But I think there actually are legacy structures in place that, unless we do a very good job of it, are going to funnel us toward underwhelming effects. And so this applies to trials and service delivery. And here's what I'd say are some of the key risks to psychedelic therapies being able to fulfill their promise. Inappropriate or unspecified patient types. I think this is key here, that we need to be empirical in our approach. We need to test things out, and I'm all for a variety of sensible variety of options, but we really do need to specify things and gather the information so we can learn what kinds of patients do well and so on. Inadequate or unspecified therapist selection, training, supervision, alliance. Again, this needs to be high, but critically we need to measure these things so that we can understand the role of things like therapist training and the components of therapist training. Inadequate or unspecified treatment protocols, things like duration, dosage, session approach. Emphasis on price in the absence of specified protocols or no assessment of long-term cost effectiveness. I think this is a real risk going forward. And the emphasis on on psychedelics as a pharmaceutical with no assessment of the amount or quality of psychotherapy. So to finish, it's well known that the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step, and many of us who work in the space have seen that there is something remarkable that can happen with psychedelic-assisted therapies. And yet, in the process of mainstreaming and rolling this out, I do think we run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so my hope is that we can really pay close attention to the best practice that we can see already available to us and collect excellent data and share that really well so that we can do a better job over the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul. Great talk. Questions, please. You can get mics.
This would probably be a great talk, Paul, and John as well. From a practical standpoint, now I realize this is only 2 months since everything has been, quote, approved. How much time and would it require from the psychiatrist standpoint to jump through all of these hoops to finally get it to the appropriate patient? Any thoughts on that?
You mean in setting up an authorized prescriber practice, like from?
No, you've got everything set up, everything's in place.
Right.
Now you're going through all the rigmarole that you have to, the
Right.
paperwork and everything else. Everything is set up. Do you have any idea how long it will take and how much time from the psychiatrist and the team's standpoint to be able to get the drug to the patient?
Yeah, so clearly psychiatrists are going to work in collaborative care teams, so they're not going to be doing all the work. And that would be a problem if we took psychiatrists out of the workforce and got them doing, days of paperwork and even necessarily 8 hours of dosing sessions. I think that can be problematic as well. So psychiatrists are going to be involved, closely involved, but they're not doing all the work. I'd suggest, different groups will do it differently. I'd suggest there'd be something in the order of 4 stages of screening, and that might be 4 or 5 hours of time. And then you'd need to move into psychotherapy, in my view, first up. So you're not doing a dosing session to start with. In our case, we'll be dosing probably about a month into treatment at the earliest. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it shouldn't be very onerous to get a patient into the front door as long as you go through all the screening steps that we go through in clinical trials anyway.
So it's not a long period of time. From the time you go through the paperwork, do all that.
No, and the prescriber is not needing to get authorized per patient. Once they are authorized as a prescriber, it's not a per patient authorization from the government. It's their medical decision. Yeah.
More questions, please.
Thank you, Tadeusz Hawrot, Parea. I was wondering about Switzerland, because there the restricted medical use of MDMA, LSD, and psilocybin is running since 1988. And I guess many thousands of patients were treated there. It's embedded within a psychotherapeutic process. And there was an interesting publication also lately in JAMA Psychiatry looking at extra pharmacological safety issues, and 2 therapists are sharing their experience. So I was wondering whether you are some sort of being inspired or maybe in touch or watching what's been happening in Switzerland, because it seems like there they had enough time for this model, which is also not a marketing authorization. It's not widespread access.
Yeah.
So similar to Australia, and I was wondering whether you've been following a little bit that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, personally, I've been in touch with some of the key Swiss groups doing this work for many years now. In Switzerland, the story is a little bit different. Until recently, it was actually like quite a closed-knit group of authorized people. Yeah, it was individuals, and it wasn't this kind of pathway that was available to any psychiatrist who could just go through the steps. Yeah, and until very recently, all the people in Switzerland that had this approval were part of the same group, the same peer group as well. So yes, they've learned a lot over time, and I've had a lot of inspiration from them. Same with the MAPS. They had this early access that in the MDMA therapy for 50 patients. Same with Therapies in Canada. They've treated a number of patients in an expanded access program. So yeah, there have been these other precedents that are related in terms of moving into service delivery. I think there are a few factors that are quite different here. As John mentioned before, this is to do with a down scheduling of a drug, which basically permits a pathway for any psychiatrist and their team, so long as they go through the steps and satisfy the requirements. And that's quite different. So it's less of a closed club or 50 patients that are able to be treated. It's much more open, and that means it's kind of more scalable, but also more concerning, because we need to ensure that everybody that's joining in has the adequate training, has the adequate oversight, is involved in the discourse. Yeah.
Time for one brief question, please. And quick answer, please.
Okay, I keep it quick. I can talk to you afterwards as well. Thanks for a great presentation. I was a bit concerned in terms of how little emphasis has been paid to the research, the monitoring, as you called it, because, like you say, so many actual patients would be excluded from the clinical trials. And this gives us such an excellent opportunity, actually, to collect real-world data over a longer period, dosing regimes, everything you mentioned, really. So, and these kind of things, this is possible. We've seen it kind of with medical cannabis. We're doing it in the UK, to be honest. But this is an opportunity in relation to medical cannabis, again, which was lost in the US a bit, to really collaborate, have a systematic data analysis over a long period of time, which is what we need, basically.
I share the concern. Yeah, I mean, there was just no legal power, as I'm told, to mandate a registry, though we petitioned the TGA, and it wasn't possible, and we petitioned the College of Psychiatrists, and it wasn't possible. I hope that clinics monitor themselves well and join registries. My concern, of course, is that the folk who are confident in doing a good job put their hand up to be monitored, and the folk that aren't, don't. So we'll see over time, but at least there'll be a subset of people that are sharing this data and publishing this data, and yeah, absolutely, my hope is that we can learn, because in so many respects, we are very much at the starting line. And I'm sure psychedelic-assisted therapy in 10 years from now will look quite different than it does today. Yeah.
I have just one final or two final questions regarding your treatment model. First, is a group treatment allowed? That would make things more cost-effective. And second, how many repeated dosing are allowed? Usually the regulators require safety data with regard to repeated dosing.
Yeah. So we are not starting with group dosing sessions, but we do move from kind of single therapy to group therapy, like a group therapy phase. Towards the latter part, yes.
And that's no group dosing. It's not allowed.
No, it's not that it's not allowed. It's just that we are starting cautiously and closer to the precedent. Yeah. So it probably could be permitted. I don't know, be interested in that.
So again, we didn't. Sorry, I'll take that. So in making the decision, we didn't want to put even more restrictions around it. So each protocol will be looked at both by the Research and Ethics Committee and then by the regulator for its merits. So if it's a quality protocol that allows group treatment, okay. If it's a quality protocol, now clearly there'd be alarm bells if it was 12 doses. But if it was, say, a protocol that said we will do two doses routinely at this interval and it's based on these studies and this evidence, fine. So there's no specification around the number of doses, but the actual number of doses is something that will be looked at very closely by the regulator because it's more related to the drug. And I expect it would be unusual for a protocol to be approved that was 6 doses straight off from the start. I think they might approve the double dose and maybe even the triple, but that's about it.
Yeah. But then there's the opportunity, of course, for that person to re-enter into treatment. And so we have, this is again unprecedented. We need to collect this data along the way to see whether we get, for example, diminishing returns or increases in safety concerns over time or the like. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to close for the coffee session. Thank you for being here. Thank you for two great speakers.